All right. I think we are live. I'm not positive, but
Says on my end we are.
okay,
Hello,
cool.
everybody.
Awesome. Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
welcome to Monocle and Spade Extra Edition. This is Ted Wright, obviously, from Epic Archaeology. I want to thank you for joining with us today as we are going to discuss a really awesome book, newly published by my friend Michael Jahosky, and we are excited to have him with us live to discuss a really, really cool topic, and that is the return of the king. And in the Lord of the Rings, it's really going to be cool. I think you're going to learn a lot, and we're excited to have him on board with us today. So, give me 1 second. Let me make sure everything is set up correctly.
Of course.
But Michael, thank you so much for joining with us today, and thank those of you who are watching through Facebook Live, our live stream. Thank you guys for watching. And you may be wondering, why in the world, Ted, would you have an interview on Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, on a website dealing with historical apologetics and archaeology? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that question. It's because myth is important. Myth is, when we think about myth, and those of you who watch Monocle and Spade may remember from a few episodes back, we interviewed Dr. David Downing, who is the co-director of the Marion Wade Center at Wheaton College. And Dr. Downing is a C.S. Lewis scholar. And we talked about myth and about this idea about myth being something that's much broader than you would typically think of as myth. Basically, when an average person thinks myth, they think of a falsehood. But actually has a much broader meaning to it, a much deeper, richer meaning to it than just something that's not true.
Yeah.
It means something that organizes reality. And so Christianity, as Lewis said, is the true myth. And Lewis was part of that great tradition of scholars and writers back in the last century, known as the Inklings. And Lewis, along with J.R. Tolkien, wrote some really remarkable books illustrating the truth of Christianity. With Lewis, of course, wrote the Chronicles of Narnia and the Space Trilogy, wrote many other wonderful books on apologetics and other types of theological and apologetics issues like miracles and stuff like that. But let me just say, before we introduce Michael officially, let me just say a couple other quick words about this. And I don't have my copy. I should have brought with me. But of course, this is the New Testament. This is my little thin line edition of the New Testament. The question that I want to sort of springboard off of today is what makes the stories in this book different than the stories that are written about by Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. There are a lot of differences. There are a lot of similarities. Today, we're going to talk about the similarities, the incredible similarities that touch on eternal truths that are mentioned in the scripture here through parable, and also through principles, just general principles of reality, just the way reality is structured, of good and evil, and good and bad, and the history is moving in a direction that we're not just floating around, in outer space, and there's no direction to history. As Lewis would say, history has a definite direction, and it's all culminating toward the return of Christ. So what makes this book different? And let me just say this. Let me give you one example, and Michael, I'll bring you here in a minute.
Sure.
One of the most famous battles. There are a lot of great battles in the Lord of the Rings, and one of the most famous battles is the Battle of Helm's Deep. And the Battle of Helm's Deep was a brutal battle, was it not, Michael?
Yes, it was.
A lot of people died in that, and there were a lot of orcs and elves and men that were involved in that. And it's written about in Lord of the Rings with great clarity and great precision, and just Tolkien was a wizard with words. He was a just amazing writer and described in detail all of the battle that took place in this ferocious battle called Helm's Deep. But the difference between the Battle of Helm's Deep and, say, a story in the Old Testament, such as the siege by the Neo-Assyrian Empire of the ancient city of Lachish. The difference is that you can actually go to Israel, you can go to northern Israel, to the site of Lachish, and you can actually go and find the ruins that date back to the 8th century BC, and you can actually find evidence, historical and archaeological evidence, that this story actually took place. Now, that's not to say that what the Lord of the Rings records isn't important. It is very important because it's illustrating the truth of struggle, the truth of the battle, and things like that. But there is a distinction between books about mythology and books about stories and the story in the Bible. The Bible is it is mythological in the sense that it organizes reality, but it's also connected to reality. That's the thing, is that the biblical writers, they connected eternal truths with actual history itself. So anyway, with that being said, Michael, welcome to the show. Sorry for blabbering on for
No, I'm
the
enjoying.
first.
I should be taking notes. This is great.
Well, this is Michael Jahosky, and he is an assistant professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida. Beautiful, sunny Florida. We all hate you now because, well, in Chicago anyway, we don't like you.
Yeah, that's right.
Nice.
That's right.
It's still, well, it's actually a beautiful day here today. It's in the,
Yeah.
you Floridians may laugh at this. It's in the 40s today here in Chicago, but we'll take it.
It's not sub-zero. Yeah.
Michael's been teaching for a little over a decade, and he's just a great all-around guy and really insightful Tolkien scholar. And it's written this really amazing book that I have a copy of right here. It's called "The Good News of the Return of the King: The Gospel in Middle Earth." So, Michael, welcome to Monocle and Spade Extra podcast. Thank you for coming on and talking about your book.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me, Ted.
Thank you so much for coming on. Well, in the beginning of your book, you talk about your road into Jerusalem and sort of this sort of what led you to make these connections. And so maybe a best way to start out with is maybe just kind of walk us through, in as brief way as you can, your journey into discovering these amazing truths that you did in the Lord of the Rings, and maybe how you came about writing this book.
Sure, I'd love to do that. And the reference is from an essay C.S. Lewis wrote, I think, called "Christianity and Culture," and you can find it in one of the new HarperCollins ebook. I think I have it in ebook editions. I can't remember what essay collection it's in, but Christianity and Culture is where that reference, where Lewis talks about one's road into Jerusalem. So by which, of course, he means one's journey to Christ and Christian discipleship. So that's basically what my preface is about. Before I talk about that, I got to say, you mean there are no ruins of Helm's Deep? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Well, I mean, if there are, we haven't found them yet.
That's right. That's a good answer.
It's like the Book of Mormon. You can say anything. Anybody can say anything, but to actually go and find it in the ground, that's a whole other thing. Now, again, that's not to say that Helm's Deep is not an awesome battle scene,
right?
But you can't go find orc helmets in Middle Earth. I don't even know where to go look.
No, it's funny. I just did on my podcast, Mythic Mission, kind of a thing about this, because Tolkien was pretty emphatic in some of his letters about, and I talk about this in chapter 1 of my book, about the historicity or the alleged historicity of Middle Earth. He even says in letter 211 that it's supposedly 6,000 years removed between the beginning of our era, maybe prehistory Mesopotamian culture, I don't know, and the fall of the Dark Lord's Tower of Barad-dûr. So he's myth building here, but I've made the point that he wasn't being literal, of course. So he knew that ultimately myths are gesturing toward the real world we live in. They have a real point to make, and you said that really well. But they are ultimately different, because Christianity is a myth, but it is also fact. It's historical fact. So I'm glad you said that, and it was well said. So my road into Jerusalem, I'll compress the story. I became Christian when I was a kid. I was baptized, received communion as a Catholic, and then my parents got divorced, and we drifted away from the church, just naturally moving about and things like that. In 2001, my mom had rediscovered Christianity, kind of a what we now know as prosperity gospel Christianity. We didn't know Joyce Meyer and Joel Osteen were not good theologians at that time. So she started reading her Bible again, and I took an interest in it. And I said, okay, I remember about this, and talking about it as if it's just anything. But that's how I slowly came back to the faith when I was 15, 16 years old, I think 16. And gradually I started taking an interest in religion again, and went on to undergrad, graduate school, started studying philosophy, history, theology, did a lot of, this thought class, Islamic thought, Hindu thought, Christian thought classes, and was really taking a deep dive. Now, in 2001, at the same time, although it was unrelated, I didn't know that there was a connection until about 2011. But I also had my brother, he started reading The Lord of the Rings to me. And we didn't finish, before the movie came out in 2001, but we continued to read past it. And then I read on my own. So I discovered Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's books and rediscovered Christianity the same year, but didn't see any connection.
Hmm.
But I remember feeling like when I was reading Tolkien's books that there was a sense of urgency and something about real life that I thought the gospel was missing. And this was due to my ignorance
Hmm.
and you know, and not really having received God fully into my life again, I think, yet. And then the last piece, I think it was 2010 or 11. I want to say it was 2011. Simply Jesus by N.T. Wright came out. And I
Yeah.
remember sitting in bed. My wife was sleeping next to me, and I'm just devouring this ebook. And I'm like, oh my God, this is like a story I've heard before. I've never heard the gospel put in terms like this, how God became king. And I thought, you know, something about that just sounds exciting. It sounds true. It sounds beautiful. And I couldn't figure out where I'd heard it before. And then I realized I'd heard it in Middle Earth.
Yeah.
And I'm not the only person to have discovered this. There was one person's testimony I relay in the book. I think Sandra Richter, and she said she had the same experience. She heard the gospel for the first time, so a little bit different than me. The first time outside, right? She heard it in Middle Earth, and so this is an
Wow.
experience a lot of people have had.
That's
Yeah,
amazing. And it's interesting that you say that because one of the things that David uh, and I spoke about, David Downing and I spoke about, was about, and of course, and I think he actually has um, yeah, he's actually has a little thing on your book there. Louis Marcos, professor at HBU,
yeah,
it just has a book just came out published called True Myth, and it's
I
about
love it.
how the Greek myths, you know, basically embody, there are eternal truths in these Greek myths,
Mm,
like Zeus and Apollo and you name it.
yep,
And so it's so cool that not Lewis, but Tolkien's book follows in that same genre, that same sort of embodying these eternal truths that even someone who's not even familiar with Christianity, or maybe, you know, maybe the gospel, they can
yeah,
get this. And so I think you hinted at it earlier when you said, you sort of said something about truth, goodness, and beauty, and
mm,
those are three things that keenly interest me
yeah,
as an apologist. Now,
hmm,
my main thing is apologetics and archaeology and historical apologetics, but
hmm.
my side hustle is aesthetics.
I love it. I love
And
it.
I actually started a PhD several years ago at the University of Wales, and I
Mm,
was going to do it in theological aesthetics. And
mm,
I was going to do some work with the theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, Swiss
mm,
theologian.
hmm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
I heard the name. Yeah.
He wrote a book called The Glory of the Lord. It's actually a 7-volume series, and it's actually part of an even larger series of 15 volumes. But
Wow.
he unpacks truth, goodness, and beauty. And
Mm.
you're talking about this with Lewis. I mean, I don't know why I keep saying Lewis.
Well, because Tolkien actually impressed this upon Lewis in 1931. It was Tolkien that arguably gave him the vocabulary to kind of explain this thing that Lewis had already experienced earlier in his life. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's a direct influence there. But yes, anyway, continue. I'm sorry.
No, no, you go
Yeah.
ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You were saying I just
No,
interrupted you, but
no.
I just want to bring out the fact that in the Lord of the Rings, even
Mm,
though it's not explicitly like John 3:16,
mhm.
the truths are there.
Sure.
And if you are, and I think this is kind of what you're saying in your book, and we're going to get in, we're going to start unpacking here a little bit,
Yeah.
but essentially, it may be a good pre-evangelistic tool, maybe even a way to bring in conversation with a lost person who
Yes.
maybe has never heard or doesn't really know a lot about Christianity. Say, hey, have you seen that movie Lord of the Rings, or have you read the
Yeah.
books? You know,
Yeah. No one has, they
so
say. I've seen the
yeah,
movies and I'm like, you're killing me. Come on. Go,
exactly,
go.
yeah,
What's a book? Some of my students, you know, they joke with
yeah,
me, they almost get me sometimes, but yeah. You know, and I told you this before we started too, but you know, what I think the big point is that it isn't only pre-evangelism. I argue that the incarnation is present in the same way that it is in Jesus's parables. And that forces us to look at how, and we know what Jesus was saying. And I would even challenge this like Wright does. Jesus wasn't telling parables to say, hey, I'm divine. That was presupposed. The gospels treat that as presupposition, Wright says.
mhm,
What he's there to say is what that means. What does the incarnation mean? What does it look like when God is a baby, when God is a man,
yep,
when God is flesh? And what that one way of looking at that, and I think a supreme image for that is the exiled and returning king. And so, how God became king and the return of the king being kind of two ways of saying the same thing. So, my argument is that the incarnation isn't present in an allegorical sense, that it is literally a borrowing from the real world, and it's exactly as we would see it in the Gospels. If Tolkien wanted to just tap people on the shoulder and say, hey, remember the story of the Gospels, that's what he would have done. But he
Yeah.
didn't want to just remind you of a story you already
Yeah.
knew. And Lewis did the same thing. He
Yep.
wanted you to expand. You think you know Christianity, but you don't. Even those of us who claim to know it well, even you and I, that we
Yep.
do, but we know it better than most. But we can still learn new things. He wanted to expand it.
Yes.
And so,
It kind of reminds me.
anyway, yeah.
It kind of reminds, and I'm sorry to interrupt. It kind of reminds me of what the
Oh,
Apostle Paul said.
hmm
I think it was in Hebrews. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe the reference verse, but it says he's talking
yeah.
about Jesus and Melchizedek,
hmm
and he says he's talking about the connection between Jesus and the Old Testament, and a lot of the imagery in the Old Testament is missed by the first century believers. And he says, I have much to say about this, but you can't
hmm
take it. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind
Yeah.
of what you're saying, is that
Yes.
there's such deep riches
hmm
in this, and that most Christians sort of miss out. And God wants to engage our imagination. He wants to not
Sure.
only engage our mind, but
Right.
also our imagination and our heart, inflame our hearts. I really think that is a very important point to make.
Me
Is that
too.
that's why I call it epic archaeology, because
Mm,
there are a couple of websites out there that have archaeology, and they're my friends, but a
hmm
lot of the websites that deal with archaeology are sort of bland and boring and dry,
mm.
and it's the story of the Bible is anything but boring. It's anything but
Exactly.
dry. And
Yeah.
Lewis and Tolkien understood that. Lewis
Yes.
with his Narnia series, and then Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, he
Yep.
is encapsulating these incredible truths and
Mm.
engaging the imagination so that people's hearts are inflamed.
Well, and why, right, Ted? Because we're incarnational beings ourselves, and the Bible tells us that we'll reign with Christ one day, as co-heirs with Christ. To mention Romans 8, I think. So what I think is really supremely important here is that God. Well, let me back up. The Lord of the Rings and the Narnia books both tell us, okay, take a look at how Jesus communicated information about himself. Look at the Bible then, at large. It's a primarily, is it a propositional book? No, it's a poetic book. Jesus came speaking in parables. Nothing did he say to them except in parables, the
Yeah.
Gospels tell us. So I think this is one of the big points about my book, is that look at the way it's being communicated, and let's peel back the layers. And I do that in the introduction in chapter 1 of my book, which I know we'll talk about. But how does the how work is what I
Yeah.
take a look at. So
Well, maybe we could get into that now. Sort
sure.
of transition now. The chapter one is, the title of it is "The Lord of the Rings as Parable," and that's kind of what you're
Mm,
saying. Maybe perhaps for our listeners and our viewers, could you sort of give us a sort of a thumbnail summary of
sure.
what do you mean by parable, and
Mm.
what is a parable, number one, and how is the series Lord of the Rings a parable? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so let me start simple, and I'll get somewhat complex,
Sure.
but I think it'll still be pretty easy to understand. So
Okay.
to answer this, I think it's important that we you can look at my bibliography. I've got a lot of great biblical scholars in there who have written book length, subjects, the book length treatments of this subject of parable. So there's a lot of other terms like metaphor, and even just not just allegory, but allegorical and fairy story when we talk about Tolkien, that we need to understand when we ask the question, in this context, what is a parable? So we'll get into that in a second, and I'll kind of show you the interrelationship as I presented in my book. But for the simple first, a parable comes from two Greek words, para and balein, meaning to throw or cast alongside, or to throw from the side. And so it is first and foremost a form of indirect communication, as a subset of mythos, which is a Greek word meaning, it can mean prophetic utterance, it can mean a narrative, it can mean a narrated worldview. We apologists talk about it that way a lot. You said it earlier really nicely. I forget how you put it, but like a narrative about reality, and that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So a parable is indirect communication, but it also tells us that it has something to do with resemblance, and it comes from the Hebrew translation. You look at the Septuagint. I'm sorry, and then the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but then you look at the Hebrew Old Testament, the word mashal, which is the Hebrew word for parable that's translated into the Greek, and that can mean a number of different things, but it has this underlying meaning of resemblance. And so parables also are drawing some sort of comparison between two seemingly unlike things.
Yeah.
And so it is also, you might say, kind of a metaphorical narrative. But then it gets more complicated from that. You have scholars like Gisela Kreglinger, who have written an excellent book called Storied Revelations about, I think it's George MacDonald's writings. And she says, but parables, yes, are metaphorical narratives.
Yeah.
And a metaphor here, how I mean this is not just the substitution, but speaking of one thing in terms that are suggestive of another,
Right.
not a this for that, but kind of
Yeah.
implicit.
One
Yeah,
of the things that I think, just for our listeners and just to kind of
please.
ground what we're talking about in something that people can sort of grasp, and
Hmm.
one of my personal favorite parables in the Gospels is the parable of the prodigal son,
Hmm.
which is an image of a son that wants his father's fortune. So
Hmm.
it's this great story Jesus tells about, and it illustrates, you've got, in the story, you've got the good son who's faithful, you got the heathen son who wants the money. He goes out,
Hmm.
spends the money on prostitutes, living the wild, living la vida loca, and then he comes back and he wants to be with his father.
Hmm.
He's out there eating with the pigs. He wants to come back to his father. This story that Jesus tells is a powerful story, and it's sort of what you're saying. It's Jesus is making a comparison between himself and the
Mm.
lost people that he has come to save. And so it's a
That's
very,
right.
as you're saying, it's a very powerful way to communicate. Now
Sure.
and as you said earlier, Michael, you said it really well, that you know, Jesus could have said that straight out. He could have said,
Yeah,
God is a loving father, and he
exactly.
will go. But he told the story because
Right.
it's sort of what you're saying, I think, with the Lord of the Rings here and with
Mm.
others, and that great truth. Some of the deepest, most profound truth can be conveyed in a story or a parable.
That's right. And I think what is the secret of that? And the parable of the prodigal son is a great example. It's the metaphoricity of a parable.
Hmm.
Metaphor is typically translated or defined as this for that,
Hmm.
this means this, but that's more actually what allegorical means. Metaphor is, as I said, speaking of one thing in terms that are suggestive of another. And so the power of parable, I think, is in its typological underpinnings, and typology is also kind of bound up with the idea of metaphors. It's suggestive. And so you think of a father had two sons. Well, there's a lot of fathers with two sons in the story of Israel.
Hmm.
And there's also a lot of applications. It's a polysemous story. It can go in a lot of different directions, but supremely, it is about God's calling of the lost Israel to reconstitute their mission as a nation of priests to bring people back into the fold. So, yeah, that is probably its most powerful meaning.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what a parable is, and we talked a little bit about the Semitic roots of parable, but a parable can also be said, so says Klein Snodgrass, a type of allegory, and you could say it the other way around if you really wanted to. An allegory is a type of parable, and his argument is that at the end of the day, a lot of ink has been spilled, and you can try to say there's more power in saying it one way or the other, but it means the same thing.
Yeah.
So I then finally draw a connection for those of you that are not familiar with the fairy story. I point out how Tolkien's sort of theory, or how would I put it, his philosophy of fairy or fairy story is very close to New Testament biblical parables. And that one of his good friends, and this was the key for me, knowing I was on the right track, who was a Jesuit priest, who was a confidant and a correspondent in many of the letters Tolkien wrote, Father Robert Murray. At the Tolkien centenary in 1992, he gave a Thanksgiving sermon that turned into an essay called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And he said that Tolkien was a poet of the kingdom, and that fairy story and parable are very close in nature.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of chapter one, is just let's unpack all those terms. How are they related? How are they not? And identifying the kind of story, and then setting us up for how truth is being communicated through parables. And as I said, the big takeaway is that it's suggestive, it's not heavy handed. God is often hidden
Hmm.
in the parables. And
Hmm.
that's one of its primary, I think, potencies, is that, as you said, God and Jesus could have just come around, and even Bart Ehrman has said this, well, Jesus didn't go in the synoptics and say, hey, everybody, I'm God, so I guess he must not be God. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
no, no, he's doing it in a very Jewish way,
That's
as
right.
one scholar has put it, Brant Petra. And he said, look, he does this through parables, and that's what we're missing.
Yeah.
And that's the key. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I have a quote from producer. Some people hate him, some people love him, but he
Yeah.
because of what he did with Star Wars. J.J. Abrams.
Oh, I know. I know. Yeah.
But Abrams said it's something about stories that we are able to live through the stories, and so that's where they're
That's
so
right.
powerful. And in fact, like movies like Star Wars
Mm,
or you name it, Star
mm,
Trek or any kind of science fiction or where it's a story and it's made up,
mm.
but there's identifiable things that people can identify with in the
Yeah,
story. So so we're all in a story as well. I mean, this is
that's right.
all of life is a story, and so we understand. I think as human beings, and I think God knows that. I mean, it makes sense. It's not like rocket science. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
the logos, the eternal logos of John 1, the one who
Mm.
spoke the universe into existence, as if he couldn't say anything, as if
Right.
he's inarticulate.
Exactly.
He's
He's
going to
not
know
lacking.
exactly how to say, what to say it, and the exact way to say it. The problem, oftentimes, though, I think just my take on this is the problem is not how it's communicated by God, because God
Mm,
does it in so many beautiful and amazing ways. The problem is that we're dense.
mm. It's
We have
us.
hard heads, and I love Eugene Peterson. Some people
Yes,
don't like him, but he said he had
I
this
do.
really amazing passage that he did an exegesis on. It's in the Old Testament, but it's something about asking God to dig our ears out,
Oh
dig
yeah,
our ears
that's
out, so that we can actually. And this is literally what the Hebrew says: is that God.
mm,
It's like it goes back to the in Isaiah. I think it's in chapter 6 where Isaiah the
unplugging.
prophet, he says, go to this people and preach and they're never going to see, they're never going to hear,
Yeah,
that was your
yeah.
mission. So so anyway, I'm sorry to get us off track.
No,
Carol,
no, it's a
it's so
conversation.
fascinating. It's great.
Yeah,
Um,
well, let me just say, I'm enjoying just listening to you as well, so this is fine. The thing I heard from John Dominic Crossan, again, I know he's a controversial scholar, but I don't agree with a lot of his views. But about
yep.
parable, I think he's spot on. He says in his epilogue to his book, "The Power of Parable," I think it is. He says something like, "Do fish know that they're swimming in the sea?" And no, we need to be reminded that we're in a story, and this is what Tolkien writes about in On Fairy Stories, is that stories remind us of many things, that we're participating in a grand narrative of human drama, which I think is best visible through the story of Israel. That's the microcosm of the whole human story. And
Yep.
so sometimes we need stories to let us know that we're in a story, and that's going back to the J.J. Abrams quote. And that's great. And I think Lewis, he wrote about being in love with a pattern of reality that nourished him more than propositions. He was all about the tone, the
Mhm.
atmosphere, the feeling, the air of the world, of the secondary world that the author made, not about the propositional utterances that you can extract from it. However valuable those are, it's ultimately the participatory quality
Yep.
of stories that we love. And so that's really powerful.
That is very powerful. And as you were speaking, a lot of like it's. I know it's a good subject when I have an author or someone I can talk to, and when they're talking, just this ideas flood. Like
I
it's just so
know.
rich. It's so
Got to write them
good.
down.
It's so good. But
Yeah.
it reminds me of something this little thing I came up with several years ago. I thought was really odd. You go to like a electronics store like what is it, Best Buy or Target or whatever, and they have all of these like televisions, these like amazing flat screen televisions, and they're like now in 4K,
Yeah.
and the funny here's the funny connection is that they have these incredible like DVD Blu-ray disc playing of these like scenes and like mountain scenes where the helicopter's flying over the mountains, or they're flying over
Mm-hmm.
the ocean or they're under the water and there's fish swimming everywhere. And we're just like going, wow, look at this amazing. I'm like, this is just a picture of the real thing. We're more
Exactly.
enamored. It's almost like we're more enamored with the picture than the
Yeah.
reality itself,
Isn't
which
that
shows you the
weird?
power of the image, the power
Yeah.
of the imagination, I
Yep.
think.
And Lewis wrote about that. I just had somebody on my show who talked about. I think it was Dr. Brian Williams, who spoke about the imagination and its ability to convey as the organ of meaning. And so, I forget what Lewis said, but he's like, what you're imagining is one thing, but what you're thinking about when you're imagining is something else. And so, images can send us in the wrong direction
Yeah.
too. But
Yeah.
you're right. The images are powerful, and we can use that or abuse it. And that makes me think of the screw tape letters.
Yeah.
Where you can use the imagination to get somebody on their knees and bring them to their knees, or you can use it to open up their worldview and show them the power of God. So it's a double-edged sword.
It
But
is.
yeah, it's Funny.
That
Yeah.
definitely is one of the most profound quotes I've ever read. I read it
Mm.
several years ago. Actually, read it by Father Thomas Dubay, who wrote a book called The Evidential Power of Beauty.
Mm.
And it was a quote from Dostoevsky, who basically said that I'm going to paraphrase it. This is the gist of it, but
Mm.
basically what Dostoevsky said, this is in the Brothers Karamazov, that beauty is the battleground where God and Satan contend for the heart of man.
Mm.
And
That's
that is
it.
so absolutely true.
That is absolutely true.
It's in the realm of beauty, that
Yeah.
because Satan is an angel of light, and so
Mm.
that's why I think the work that you're doing and books that you're writing, like this book here that you've written, need to be out there, and Christians need to read this, because
Thank you.
it is a battleground, and we have got the King of the universe, the Creator of the universe,
Mm.
who we worship, and we need to be out there communicating this amazing, beautiful truth,
Yeah.
um, in a way that's beautiful and imaginative. So
Yep.
anyway,
Amen. Yeah.
anything else you want to say about the parable chapter? That's chapter one. We're kind
No,
of
I think that's pretty good. I mean, so, as I said, it's just kind of unpacking the connection and relationship, all those literary terms and the philosophy behind them, and then connecting it to the body of Tolkien's writing. And one last thing I will say is that I try to address the contentious issue that I don't think needs to be contentious anymore, is that Tolkien wrote some kind of allegory. Well, it's a well-known fact, if you look very carefully in his letters, that he admitted to writing one, just not the kind of allegory people said he did.
yeah,
And this is a bit more complicated. I go into it in my book, so I'll let readers dive into it. But um, it's been such an issue, and it doesn't have to be. And as I came up researching for my book, one of the frustrating things was all of these really brilliant Tolkien scholars were missing what was right in front of me, and I got it from reading biblical scholars who are writing about this subject, and that helped me kind of understand that what Tolkien was saying, and that's what was kind of a key to unlocking the subtleties to his multi-purpose use of the term allegory. So, I present a pretty in-depth argument in chapter one, but it's a doozy. But if you stay with it, it'll pay off. So,
yeah.
yeah,
I always think that this is my professor coming out, that
yeah,
Christians, and I think you and I are on the same page, Michael, on
mm,
this. That if you're a Christian, if you're a child of God, you never stop learning, and we know
no,
that full well. And the joke with a lot of Christian scholars is from their wives, you don't need another book. You've got too many books.
that's why I've got an
You're
ebook
like,
now.
but they're for research, honey. They're
Yeah,
you're
it's for
never
a
going to
good
read all.
cause.
Well, they're not all to read. They're not. You
Yeah,
don't just get a book to read it like a novel. They're
no,
research. You refer to them
exactly.
again and again.
Yep,
But
yep,
books like yours, I think, for someone who may be a little intimidated by some of the scholarship in it,
sure.
although it's very easy to read,
Thank you.
learn. I mean, get this and dig into it and
Mm,
grow and expand your faith. Because here's the thing: at the end of the day, when you learn, the greater capacity you have to learn about your faith in a deeper, richer way, the more
mm,
capacity you will have as a worshiper. And the
yep.
more capacity you will have as a child of God to be
Amen.
effective in the world. God
Yep.
can use anything, but he can use a knife that's been sharpened. And I think when we
Mm,
grow, and this is things like this, learning about parable and learning about the power of story and the power of how God uses story,
mm.
can make us sharper, even as we're witnessing and as we're sharing the gospel. Sorry.
Yeah.
Michael,
No.
let me
No.
jump
Amen.
ahead.
Preach it.
Let me jump ahead to chapter 3. We're going to skip over,
Sure.
unless there's something. The Lord of the Rings
No.
is
No.
good news.
Yes. Yes. Let's do
Michael,
that.
how is the Lord of the Rings good news? Tell us.
Well, simply, it is a story of Exodus Reditus. It's the story of the exile returning to his throne. And isn't that what the story of the Bible is about? And to be more scriptural about it, I think of First Samuel chapter 8, when Samuel's being asked to elect a king, help elect a king over the Israelites. And they're saying, we want to be like the other nations, make
Yep,
us like the other nations. And he goes, you don't know what you're asking for. Let me go talk to God. And it's a great scene, and
it
God says,
is
listen, Samuel, they're not rejecting you today. They're rejecting me. And
me.
you know what?
Yep.
They've been doing it since the Exodus. They've been
Mhm.
doing it since they left Egypt.
Yep.
Well, we had this in Egypt. Yeah, well, you're going to have this when you listen to me. Okay. So it's me they're rejecting. God is king today, not you, Samuel. So, then we get into Saul and David and Solomon. So we know about that. But from that point and even earlier back to the creation and all the way to Revelation, the story is, or you could, and please understand, folks, I'm not reducing the Bible to a marriage metaphor or a return of the king metaphor. I know that the Bible is a multivalent book, and it can be woven together with several strands of themes. But what I'm saying for me, and for a lot of people that I've read as I researched and wrote this book, the power of the image the type of the Return of the King is for some reason very powerful. And I'll give you an example of why. Um, Peter Kreeft wrote a book called The Philosophy of Tolkien, and it's a really great book. And it's
Yes.
kind of, yeah, you've read
Excellent.
it. Yeah, good,
Yes.
good. So, I think in his metaphysics chapter 1, he talks about, among many other things, the metaphysics, he talks about why we love stories with kings in them. And as Americans, we don't like that because,
Yeah.
George Washington with the levees and, His Excellency. Yeah, right. We started off that way, but then it was like, yeah, let's not do this. And it's too close to King George. But English people, they understand at least a constitutional monarchy today, and so other countries and governments are more at home with this. So Krepp says that we're not at home with it, but our heart both wants it,
Mhm.
has it, and wants one.
Mhm.
And he's like an Arthur who's in the subconscious of our
Yes.
mind, and he yearns to return to that throne. And for me, Krepp's explanation made me feel less crazy when I was analyzing and reflecting on my journey, thinking, what was it particularly for me as a Christian and as a fledgling Christian coming to faith, as my conversion was very gradual, that really seized my heart. And there it is again with aesthetics, right? It's all about the heart.
Yep.
And it was this image of Exodus Reditus, right? The exile and return king. So I think that's what primarily makes it good news. And if you look at Jesus's parables and you read biblical scholars like Klein Snodgrass and Amy Jill Levine and Brant Petra, and some of these are Catholics, some of them are Protestants, and some of them are Jews, actually, like Dr. Levine, and you read their books, they'll say, while not reducible to just being stories about the return of the king, a lot of Jesus's parables have kings or monarchical themes to them
Mhm.
that adds credence and credibility to this thesis of mine. So,
And
yeah.
the interesting connection between, say, Aragorn
Mm,
in the Lord of the Rings and going down into the earth to get
there you go.
the ghost army,
I love that.
and
Paths of the Dead.
to
Yeah.
call them to fulfill their oath.
So cool.
There's a lot of powerful imagery of
Sure.
Christ descending into Hades, which literally
Mm,
doesn't necessarily mean hell; it just means the
no.
grave. He
Right.
goes to the grave, and he
Yeah.
comes back, the victorious king.
Yep.
But he has
Yep.
not yet returned, and
No.
that's
It's
but the
great. Yeah.
exiled king, yeah.
Yeah. So I love the Paths of the Dead. I talk about it obviously in the book, and you'll notice that it's kind of out of sequence. If we were expecting it to be a one-for-one allegory,
Mhm.
then we would expect that to have happened, on Holy Saturday. When the king is in the ground.
Mhm.
But it doesn't. The king is alive in the Lord of the Rings, and he's going into the realm of the dead to, as you said, to get these men that broke their oath to Isildur to come back and fight for the real true king.
Yeah.
So if it were an allegory, the kind that Lewis and Tolkien disliked, as Tolkien famously said, we would expect it to be
Yeah.
exactly a carbon copy, and it's not.
Yeah.
Uh,
Exactly.
that's why it's powerful.
It's very powerful.
Mhm.
We are sort of. I knew this. We're going to go over. We'll go over a few minutes. If
Okay,
it's okay with you, Michael. You have
I'm
to
fine with it.
go.
No,
Okay.
no, I'm all
Um,
yours.
we're right at not quite an hour yet. We're just a few minutes under. But
Okay.
let's sort of tie a bow on this and talk
Mm,
about. You have it's 5 chapters long.
mhm.
It's very very thorough.
Well,
But
thank you.
let's go back to. I just want to pull out some of the things you've talked about. We talked about the scholarship, but
Mhm.
for our listeners, could you perhaps give what is one of your favorite episodes in the novels themselves? I know you probably have a million, but
Mm.
one that stands out that maybe illustrates some of the things you've talked about.
Mhm.
Tell us the scene. Maybe I don't know how you feel about this. Maybe if
Yeah.
it's in the movie, you could say, hey, remember that part when
Yes.
whatever.
Oh, I could definitely
Tell us
connect
about
it.
a scene that you really stands out to you that illustrates these truths in a powerful way.
So I'm happy to. I've got so many, but forgive me, Tolkien nerds and fans out there, if I don't have it in front of me. But on the spot, I can answer it. I just don't know all the references. But of course, it's notated in my book. But there's a chapter I think called the Palantir in. I think it might be in the Return of the King, in
Hmm.
the first
Hmm.
part of the Return of the King. So don't quote me on it. But it's when they're still at Helm's Deep, and the Great Company is getting ready to go on its mission. The sons. This is
Yes.
not in the movie. This is not in the movie. Elrohir and Eladon, the sons of Elrond, are coming, and Aragorn has his quest he's going to go on, I think. And again, I might be mixing up some of it, but the scene is kind of, that's the context, and he's he's got the Palantir that one of the hobbits had found at Isengard, and he challenges Sauron in kind of like a revelation battle where he looks into it. Now, keep in mind the backstory is the Palantiri were, it's the plural, of course, were the seeing stones of the Numenorian ancestors of Aragorn. And these Numenorians were, of course, offspring of elves and men. They had a mixed blood, so they were, kind of
So,
long life, right?
so the
Yep.
seeing stone, just for the listeners who
Yeah.
are not familiar with it, this is like a little stone that like you can
Mhm.
see into the future. If you look into,
Right.
it's like a crystal ball, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's exactly right. Yeah, and the Palantir was also a form of communication between the different keeps and garrisons around Middle Earth when the Numenorians were in charge in the Second Age of Middle Earth for a time. So he looks into it and he challenges Sauron, and it's one of those moments that I talk about in the book that is a real revelation of the Ranger is kind of falling away. The bedraggled son of man who is has foxes have holes,
Mhm.
birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to
Yeah.
rest his head. But here he is, and he's now the king, and you see him, and you're like, oh my God, this is powerful. And he tells him basically, I'm coming for you. And
Wow.
it's a great scene. There's another one just real quick in the Fellowship, which viewers of the movie will be familiar with as they're sailing between the Argonath statues, the ancestors of Aragorn. And in the book, not in the movie, you get a description of the hobbits looking at Aragorn, and they see the old weather-worn ranger, as he's often described, falling away, and a king returning from home to his
Wow.
home out of exile. So
Wow.
it's just a very obvious moment, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is
So
very, very powerful. I'll tell
mhm.
you one of mine, and I don't know
Please.
again how to interpret this as far as in the context we're talking about Return of the King, because
Hmm.
there, throughout the novels, the three
Mm.
books in the series, there's a lot of different. Each character can represent multiple things. I think,
Mm.
if I'm
Yeah.
wrong, maybe I
No, no,
think.
you're right.
And I think Gandalf can represent sort of a messianic figure, maybe even a prophet.
Yep.
Certainly a prophet. He was an advisor, to King Theoden,
Hmm.
and he was also an advisor to Aragorn. But there's also some messianic overtones to him as well, where he
Definitely.
goes to fight in the Barad-dûr, I think, the
Mm.
demon, you know, and he
Yeah.
falls down. But the scene that really gets me, this is just, I get chills when I saw the movie, and I
Yeah.
don't know
Yeah.
how. I think it's pretty accurate, but
Mm.
they're in the Battle of Helm's Deep, and so he had told weeks or months before, had told Aragorn, "Look for me on the third day or
Mm.
whatever at dawn."
Hmm.
And just when things are absolutely at their worst, it looks like
Mm.
they're about to be overrun by all these demons, these horde of orcs and goblins from Mordor.
Hmm.
All of a sudden, he hears a horn, and he
Mm.
looks up on the horizon, and the beam of the sun just
Mm.
shines down the mountain, and they all
Mm.
turn around, and he's sitting on a white horse.
Oh yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
he, oh man, I just got
It's
chills telling
brilliant.
that story.
Me too. Me hearing it.
I just think about Christ returning again, and how
Mm.
the fear he is going to strike into this earth. When I do believe in a literal second coming of Christ. I mean, no
I
one
do
knows the
as
day of the
well.
hour. No one knows
No.
that. Christians disagree about eschatology.
Hmm.
We're not going to get into all that. But the
Sure.
core belief of all Christians, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant or whatever, is that
Mhm.
we believe, according to the Apostles' Creed, that Christ will come again,
Yep.
and that the king will return. And this imagery, I think, with Gandalf come riding on the white horse, and
Yeah.
with having this army with him. Now, even though he's not Aragorn,
No.
there is
No.
that sort of imagery there.
Well, there is, and Ted, I share your goosebumps with that. In the book, it's kind of different, but the power is still there. It's even better. But he brings
Yeah.
back a guy, Erkenbrand, I think it was, not Eomer as it is in the movies. But anyway, it's the same kind of scene. It's beautiful. It's powerful. But there is a threefold office of Christ that we speak of in Christian theology of king, priest, and prophet from the letter to Hebrews, and I think among other places it can be alluded to. But that's been a well-known fact that Tolkien scholars, even Phil Ryken, who I feel like is associated up there
He
in one,
is.
yeah, Phil Ryken,
Yes. Yeah,
Wheaton
Wheaton.
College, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
he's written a book that I cite in my book. It's called "The Messiah Comes to Middle Earth," and it does some similar things that I've tried to do. And he writes, I think, pretty persuasively about this. And the threefold office is what I was alluding to here. So
Yes.
yes, other characters can be messianic. And even in Frodo, you can see the kingly, and in Aragorn, the priestly. or the prophetic. And so, yes, that is part of the power of the parable, is that the allegorical correspondences break down. And then
Yep.
one last thing is that the chapter 2 of my book, and the parables are good news stories, we should expect to see intimations of the second coming, the parousia, as well as information about the first coming, right, the incarnation, in a Christian story. And so I think we see it in kind of already and not yet. We see glimpses of
Yep.
both, which is really great.
Yeah,
Yeah, really
absolutely.
great.
It's just amazing. The
Mm-hmm.
last chapter you have is Estelle. How do you,
Mm-hmm.
is it Estelle? Is that what you
Estelle,
say?
Estelle. Yep.
Estelle.
Yep.
Tell us just briefly,
Brief.
what's
Yeah.
the gist of it? Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
it's a
why did you end it with that? That's a really unique way to do that. And
thank
yeah.
you. Yeah, so Estel means hope, I think, in one of the Elvish languages. It's one of two words for hope. I can't remember the other one, but it's a messianic type hope. And I ended this way because you'll notice in the introduction, I structure the book and the book overview as a retrospective journey. And I use for the justification of this working backwards through Tolkien's books because of two reasons. One, because I think Tolkien said or alluded to in his letters that this was the best way to read it. And other Tolkien scholars have argued this. So I'm
Yep.
standing on their shoulders. And two, because Jesus taught us to read scripture
Yep.
typologically this way. Luke 24, the road to Emmaus. And so chapter 5 is actually the earliest layer of Middle Earth mythology. We look at the Silmarillion and the debate of Finrod and Andrath. And that story in particular, which will not be familiar to a lot of listeners, is in the words of one Tolkien scholar, the most incarnational and Christian of all of Tolkien's writings. Even Christopher Tolkien thought that,
Yeah.
and saw it as an extension of Christian theology for his father. And it was written in the late 1950s after The Lord of the Rings was done.
Wow.
So I end there because we're ending with the early prophecy, I think, of the incarnation in Middle Earth, and I link it to the Return of the King. And so Estelle, of course, is one of Aragorn's names, is secretive names that Elrond and his mother give him.
Wow.
And so that's the connection. Yeah.
Love it. I love it. Hope.
Thanks. Yes, hope.
And I tell you what, folks, if there's ever been a time in history that the world needs a message of hope, it is now.
It
is now that we need to hear that. And folks, let me just bring this back full circle to talk about, we've been talking about this amazing series, this book about this amazing series. The book is The Good News of the Return of the King by Michael Jahosky and The Gospel in Middle Earth. I want to encourage you to get this. You can get it on Amazon. And Michael, any other places that do you have how can people get in contact with you if they want to? Do you have a website? Do you have a podcast?
I do.
Tell us how to get a hold of you.
Sure. I don't know if I can do it in the chat to you, but if you just Google me, I have a WordPress website. I've got to probably update the URL, but it's like lastdunedancom.wordpress.com. So it's a little bit wordy, but if you just WordPress my last name, you'll find I have a WordPress. If you go to my YouTube channel, and here's an easy way to look it up, Mythic Mission is my podcast and YouTube channel name, Mythic, like myth, mission. And on the YouTube channel, I've got links to my website and a bunch of book reviews. And if you want to read a review of the book, I've got a couple on there. So I can get, you can get in touch with me and follow me in a number of different ways on social media as well. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm glad to see that you are there in Hobbiton. I don't know if it maybe after we get off the podcast, you're going to go maybe smoke some pipe weed or maybe,
you bet.
Whatever. Hey, that's your business.
Hey, the tobacco now. Yeah,
that's right.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. No, but let's end on this. We've been talking about the good news of the Return of the King, and on Epic Archaeology, one of the videos we created for for YouTube is, does history have a direction? And I want to end with this. And Lewis wrote. I found this. Gosh, it's been about a year and a half ago. I actually found it when I was at the Marion Wade Center here in Chicago, in Wheaton, actually. And I think I had heard about it before, but I never really read it. And I was just blown away. And it's called The World's Last Night by C.S. Lewis. And he talks about the second coming, and he talks about history. And today, especially in American culture, we have this whole notion of cultural Marxism and this whole idea about critical race theory that is entrenched in ideas about history, and that history is in this sort of cycle, and it's a very, very Hegelian Marxist sort of cycle. Lewis just throws a hammer at the base of that and says, listen, Christianity, the view of Christianity, the Christian view of history is diametrically opposed to any modern notions of this, that things are going to get better, that somehow we can make things better. And that, again, we're not trying to be negative here. It's just that that isn't the Christian worldview, that history is going in a direction. And Lewis, in his book, The World's Last Night, talks about the fact that he makes the mention of the fact that the director of the play is going to, the curtain's going to come down, and it's going to come down suddenly, and it's going to be over with. And this world will be done, and the director is going to walk out on the stage. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, very powerful imagery. I want to encourage you folks, if you've never read The World's Last Night by C.S. Lewis, you need to check that out. It's fantastic. And also, don't forget this book here by Michael, The Good News of the Return of the King, and also Lord of the Rings as well.
Yes, don't forget that.
Don't forget that. You have to read that.
Ted, would you mind if I just read a brief thing from the end of my first chapter of my book? Okay.
Yes, please.
I love that essay by Lewis. I encountered it in a daily devotional of Lewisian writings, and I remember coming across it, and I love it. And I agree with you about critical theory, and I've been reading up on it and trying to have a compassionate approach to people who have different ideas than we do about this. So that's a great essay, great resource to help you do that. But to kind of parallel quote from my book that reflects what you just said is this. I say that, reality is not what it is supposed to be, and we sense that it ought to be different. I quote Timothy Keller here, who soberly reminds us that Christianity teaches that there is, quote, a tragedy and a sadness to life from which no amount of celebration or rejoicing can provide a full escape. Some wounds never really heal. The festal joy that Jesus brings is always partial in this life, never full. And C.S. Lewis was right in saying that the best havings are wantings. And, Tolkien and Lewis would agree that, it's not a negative appraisal of reality. It's a realistic one. And we can't get there on our own steam. We need God's help. So amen to that.
And we need the king to return. And until that time, we need to occupy, we need to be salt, we need to be light in the culture, and we need to use truth, goodness, and beauty. We need to defend the faith once and for all, entrusted the saints. We do this at epicarchaeology.org. We've got some really cool stuff coming up in the future. But Michael, with that, thank you so much for coming on and discussing your book. We could have probably went on for another hour or two because we just barely, to use a mixed metaphor, we just scratched the tip of the iceberg.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Ted, for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and thank you guys for watching on Facebook. I know that there'll be many people who are watching, tuning in later, but thank you guys for watching. And I know that Michael follows us also in Epic Archaeology. So if you do have any questions, Michael, we'll probably be able to answer those in the comment section on Lord of the Rings or anything about some of the things we've talked about today. But again, for Monocle and Spade Extra today, this is an author interview. We want to thank you so much again for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a great day, and God bless. Take care.